Humanitarian operations in the Gaza Strip have crumbled as Israel's bombing campaign now enters its third month. On Thursday, the United Nations humanitarian chief announced, quote, "We do not have a humanitarian operation in southern Gaza that can be called by that name anymore." Tens of thousands of displaced Palestinian civilians are now crammed into two tiny patches of land. One is along the coastline, and the other is on the border city in the south. The UN has slammed these sites as a poorly planned solution whose overcrowded and unsanitary conditions make them rife for spreading disease and hunger. Conditions at these sites have deteriorated to the point that there's one toilet for every 600 people, according to UN report. As a result, the World Health Organization warns that more Palestinians could soon die from disease than from Israeli bombs. Meanwhile, on Thursday, Israel announced that it would open a second crossing into Gaza. It's restricted to inspections for incoming humanitarian aid only. On Friday, nearly 57,000 pounds worth of U.S. aid for Gazans was delivered to Egypt, but UN officials warned that Israel's bombing campaign, coupled with endless displacement, have made the humanitarian situation even more dire. On Monday, UN humanitarian chief Lynn Hastings stressed that, quote, "the conditions required to deliver aid to the people of Gaza do not exist," end quote. Israel's response to that statement, by the way, was to revoke her visa. Meanwhile, the primary UN agency that facilitates humanitarian assistance for all of Gaza is just barely operating, according to its head. In a letter posted to X, he warned, quote, "Our staff take their children to work so they know they are safe or can die together. I've never written such a letter predicting the killing of my staff and the collapse of the mandate I am expected to fulfill," end quote. The war has resulted in more than 17,000 deaths, with 70% being women and children, according to the Gaza Health Ministry. NBC cannot independently verify those numbers. On Thursday, Secretary of State Antony Blinken informed Israel that casualties are still unacceptably high. In an additional sign of the growing rift between the United States and its longtime ally, American officials this week began discussing post-war governance plans with Palestinian Authority officials and regional Arab allies. The talks come on the heels of Netanyahu rejecting the return of the Palestinian Authority, which administers some of the occupied West Bank and used to administer Gaza. With more on this, I'm joined by Diana Buttu, the former spokesperson for the Palestine Liberation Organization. She is also the former legal advisor to the Palestinian Mahmoud Abbas. Diana, good to see you, my friend. Thank you for being with us. I was talking to Hanan Ashrawi an hour ago, and she was saying this conversation about what happens next is very hard to have until there is a ceasefire, an end to what's going on in Gaza, and that is valid. However, people like you and her have been thinking about this for a very long time, and there is an obvious question about what does happen next, and specifically as it relates to Palestinians. Who speaks for them, and how is that established? What's your thought on that?
In a way, she's right. Actually, she is right, which is it's impossible to be able to determine what the future looks like when we don't know what tomorrow is going to look like. But that said, I think it is very important for the first time for the world to actually listen to Palestinians and to have us decide who our leaders are rather than the West decide or the Israelis decide who our leaders are. And I say this because before October the 7th, Mahmoud Abbas, the president, had been largely irrelevant to the U.S. administration. And now we are in a state where they're asking him to step in, where he hasn't been able to effectively rule in the West Bank. So the idea of them asking him to step in and rule in Gaza, where his popularity is very low, where he abandoned Gaza many, many years ago, is ridiculous. This is why it's so vitally important for Palestinians to be choosing our own leaders and to be choosing and then telling the world what it is that we're going to look like. But the precondition to that is not only a ceasefire, but an ironclad guarantee that Palestinians are going to finally be free, not living in yet another situation of military occupation where Israel can come in and do whatever it pleases, whenever it pleases.
I want to ask you about this because when we talk about Gaza, I see a lot of things on social media, which I'm about a day away from just quitting, that say, why don't these Gazans just kick Hamas out? Why don't they change it? And I often say, why don't the Russians get rid of Putin? They know that he's harming their existence. But it speaks to an issue of agency, right? That you lived in Gaza, I believe, before or just when Hamas took power. The average Gazan doesn't have a great deal of agency about who their government is at the moment.
Correct. You're absolutely right. I did live in Gaza, and you're right. They don't have a lot of agency. And the reason is that we had an election in 2006. In those general elections in 2006, Hamas won the election. And even though they won the election, the rest of the world said, we're not going to recognize this election. And they didn't allow Hamas to rule. This is what led to the separation between Fatah, the major ruling party, and Hamas, which is the party that runs the Gaza Strip. And so it's this idea that people who are now in their 30s, they've never had a chance to vote in any of the elections. And so there hasn't been agency given to Palestinians, because every time there is a demand for an election, the demand becomes you either choose the people that we want you to choose, or you're not going to have the election. That is obviously not a recipe for the future. This is why it's so vitally important for people to finally listen to us. And the one message that they should be taking away is that Palestinians deserve their freedom, and we deserve the right to choose our own leaders, not have leaders imposed on us from the outside.
Well, you and I have known each other for many, many years. You and I were in Israel together, where you live. You and I were in the West Bank together, and we met civil society leaders, people who would build society. Tell me about what that looks like right now, because there's a world that's saying, are there people who are leaders? There are some who are jailed. There's references to Marwan Barghouti, who consistently polls higher than existing Palestinian Authority leaders. Give me a sense of that. What does that look like to you? And is Marwan Barghouti a name that Americans should start to become familiar with?
But when we look at Palestinian leadership, it's important to keep in mind that Israel has either imprisoned them, as is the case with Marwan Barghouti, or they've assassinated them. And there hasn't been an ability for Palestinians to be able to choose their own leaders. Looking at civil society, we even see that when it comes to the civil society spectrum, that even there we've seen that Israel has labeled these organizations as somehow terrorists, even though nobody around the world recognizes this. And so even then we see an attempt of the Israelis to try to choose Palestinian leaders. Should people become more familiar with the name Marwan Barghouti? Most certainly. But I think more than that, they should become familiar with the Palestinian cause. And it's a cause for freedom. It's a cause for Palestinians demanding that they not live under Israel's boot any longer, but that we have the ability to choose our own leaders, whether that's in this realm of political leaders, civil society leaders, or in any spectrum around. And that's the missing element, is that there's always an attempt to somehow choose the leaders for us, or to kill them, or to imprison them. And there hasn't been this idea that Palestinians get to be free, they get to choose their own leadership, they get to do as they please. And instead, it's always a question of appeasing Israel rather than appeasing Palestinians.
Diana, good to see you again. Thank you for being with us. Diana Buttu is a former spokesperson for the Palestinian Liberation Organization.